Welcome to this Gearwig modeling guide on batch painting. Batch painting is just a quick and easy way to paint several similar models, like this unit of Pharaoh brigands, in a sort of assembly line fashion. We want to end up with a unit of highly detailed models without having to spend a lot of time on them. And to do this, we'll break the job up into 3 basic tasks. First, we'll handle all the base coats. We'll then use simple washes for all of the shadows. And we'll finish by using a fine detail brush to pick out the highlights. However you paint your models, you always want the shadows of the model to be darker than the base, and the raised areas to be a little lighter. This adds depth to your model and makes it look more alive. The methods we use in this video will be super quick and super easy, but will still result in nice looking models. It's always best to start a job like this with a plan. Here we see a pig man with a bunch of crap stuck to him. He is, ultimately, a bunch of armor on top of belts, on top of cloth, on top of fur, on top of skin. I usually start with the lowest element first, which is to say the skin. That way I can slop all over the other elements and not worry about it, knowing that I'll paint those afterward. In this particular case, I have a plan for their armor to make it look rusty that will use a lot of dry brushing. So much so that if I start with the skin, I'm afraid I will slop onto it with dry brushing and have to retouch it. So, unlike normal, I'm going to start with their armor bits on the top, and then go back down to the bottom of the stack, their skin, and work from there. After I've glued them together, I glue these pins to their feet. I'll use these later when I pin them to the bases. These pins also made it easier to prime these guys. While painting, I'll have them pinned into these little styrofoam cones so they're easy to handle. Much easier in the hand than a 30mm base is. It's much more comfortable. It's also very lightweight. A lot of people use corks for this, and that's great too. We'll start our rusty armor effect by using some Mournfang brown, a very rusty brown color, and base coating all the armor bits with it. The general idea here is to paint all the metal bits like they're completely rust, and then we'll dry brush on some metal later to make it sort of look like the rust is coming through the metal. This is a super lazy, super easy way to get a pretty good effect. And with our batch here, we're trying to go for some nice detail as fast as possible. We hit all the armor plates, the gun barrel, and the weapon on his back. I aim for a nice uniform coat on these, but it's okay if a little black splotches through. The overall effect will be metal with some bits of rust coming through the metal, and if some of that is black, that's cool too. Adds a little bit of depth. It doesn't take long at all to hit all the models with this paint. I'm not careful about splashing onto the other areas, we're just going to paint them anyway, so if a bunch of this rust gets on the fur or on his skin, that's fine, as long as all the armor is hit. The next step involves dry brushing a lighter brown on top of this rusty brown. I use this XV88 here, and plan to liberally dry brush all over the rusty areas. This step is optional, it just adds a little bit of like a different color rust that will shine through. It might add some depth, but it's not mandatory and it's barely noticeable. It is just very easy to do. Like before, I keep it real quick. I'm not afraid of slopping onto other areas. I don't need to get every aspect of the rust, every corner, every edge. I just try to spread it around and make it look a little different. And our finished rust layer looks like this. Next we'll dry brush on some metal. I'm going to use lead belcher here, sort of a nice dark metal color. Just like the last step, we'll dry brush over all the rusty areas. It'll automatically pick out the raised areas for us, and any recessed areas, like areas in between armor plates, will stay rusty. No metal bits will get in there, it'll just look dark red and brown, kind of where you might expect rust to be anyway. So you get sort of a nice shadowy effect in the lower areas, and a nice metal effect in the raised areas for very, very little work. You can just dry brush here to taste. If you do very little dry brushing, it'll still look metal. It'll just look like super rusty metal. If you dry brush a lot very heavily, it'll look almost like it's base coated in metal, but with just some rust in the lower areas. So depending on how grimy and dirty you want your metal to look, you just keep passing over with the dry brush over and over again. When using Citadel paints like this one to dry brush, you can take it right out of the pot. You don't need to water it down. It's nice and thick and goopy, perfect for dry brushing. You want to dip your brush in the paint and then wipe it off onto, say, a paper towel vigorously so there's barely any paint left. You don't want it to go on wet or goopy. You just want to sort of scrape it on. So you don't want a lot of paint on the brush at all. Dry brushing is hard on these brushes, so it's best to use a crappy old brush like this. I tend to take my old base coat brushes, the ones that are becoming pretty worn down, and I clip off the tip so it's a little squared off, and then I just use those for dry brushing. And our metal effect is done. Normally I'd paint these later in the project because I'd want to get the skin and the fur handled first, and I'd want to paint the armor later because it's so near the top of the model. But since I wanted to use this specific technique that used tons of dry brushing, I swapped the order around a little bit just because I knew the dry brushing would be messy. So that's just sort of a call I made, and I think it worked out. So base coating might be a little trickier now, but nothing we can't handle. Plus we got a pretty cool rust effect for almost no work. Now we can start base coating our pigskin. I came up with a nice pigskin mixture a while back. It uses Mournfang brown and some of this Jokero orange. I think I go 2 Mournfangs to 1 Jokero, but it gets sort of a nice piggy color. And since I don't want to slop on the armor now, I use a fine detail brush for the rest of this project. If this were our first step, you could just slop on a bunch of this and not care where you splash around, but we're going to be careful around the rusty armor, so we'll use a fine detail. Base coating is always the worst step. It takes the longest. Often you have to use multiple coats if the primer shines through. So this is the hardest part of the project. It's easy skill-wise. All you have to do is not splash onto your armor. But it's time-consuming compared to the other details we're going to put on. And there's really no cheating around this. You have to hit every part of skin with this color, and that's just the way it is. When we're done, the skin looks like this, and then we'll just keep continuing with our base coating steps. The next element up our stack was fur. So fur, then cloth, then belts. We'll just keep working up the model. When our base coats are done, they look like this. When we were painting the skin, we had to be careful not to slop onto the armor. And when we jumped up to fur, we had to be careful not to slop onto the skin or the armor. And it went progressively like that. Each element we went up to, we had to be a little bit more careful not to touch the other elements. But at the same time, that element was higher up the model and there usually was less of it. So it was easier to paint. We didn't have to get down into his armpits or other weird little blocked off areas because we were sure to get those first. Start at sort of the bottom of the model, so to speak, and then work your way up to the crap on top, like these bags, his tusks, his belt, stuff like that. And the job ends up being easy. Base coating is the most time-consuming part, but once you're done, the rest of the details are nice and quick and look great. We're going to use our washes next. We're going to use a brown wash called Agrax Earthshade on most of the model, since he basically consists of a bunch of different kinds of browns. Then this dark brown wash will work nicely on all the shadows. I'll start with the khaki elements here. The way I handle this khaki stuff is by dumping tons of wash onto it. I barely water the wash down at all. I take it almost right out of the bottle and then dump it on heavily all over the khaki. I use the same sort of heavy wash on the fur to get down in the cracks to add a shadowy effect. I see a lot of painters use heavy washes for every aspect of their model, and I'm not crazy about it at all times. As we'll see when we do the skin later, we'll use what's called like a focused wash. We'll keep it nice and fine and detailed. These heavy washes can leave smudges and smears on your base coated areas. And sometimes that's good. I really like it on the khaki elements. It looks like dirty khaki. And that's sort of what I'm going for. So it's a nice, easy way to get that detail that I like. But if I were to do it on skin, I wouldn't like it. It would smudge up the skin in a way I'm not crazy about. There are some other elements, colored metal, some other stuff where I don't really like the effect of a big heavy wash where it just looks like a wash. Like I can see where the water of the wash coagulated on the model, and I can see little smears and swoops and puddles and stuff, and I don't like it. So if we're putting shadows on the skin elements here, we're going to use the more focused wash. I take the same Agrax Earthshade, but I water it down. It's about 50% out of the bottle and 50% water. And then I take a fine detail brush here, and I just hit the shadowy areas, like inside his ear, under his armpit. I'll get his eye socket. I'll get the place in the skin where shadows should be, under his muscles, in between his biceps and such like that. But I won't just splash it on. I'll leave the raised areas clean of it, so it doesn't leave smears or anything. I just want it to pool into the little shadow areas, and I want to be focused about it. Just a little bit goes a long way here, and it'll really pop later when we add highlights to the raised areas. When all our washes are done and dried, make sure they are dried, it's time to do highlighting. Always start the highlighting with the eyes. We'll use some white scar here to paint the eyeballs. It's easy to slop around with the eyes. I'm not a perfect painter here, so I'm certainly going to slop with the eyes. And I found it's easy to assume you're going to slop these up, and then you can just touch them up later when you're highlighting the skin. So I take some white paint, I thin it down nicely, and I try to get it inside his eye socket here. I make sure I have the entire eye covered. That one wasn't bad. I usually do a lot worse than this. The odds of me landing both eyeballs without splashing all over the place is those odds are low. But that's okay, that's all part of the process. Working under the assumption we're going to slop this up. And of course here I do. Sloppy. While those eyes are drying, we do the next highlight. We'll highlight the fur. It's always easy to dry brush fur. You don't have to pick out every little hair. You just hit it with this dry brush. Dry brushing is a little messy, and it could splash onto some of our other elements. So I'm sure to get this highlight out of the way quickly. And maybe if I splash onto a belt or something, I can pick it up on the belt highlighting step without having to retrace our steps. Again, we're all about speed here, and intelligently painting in an order such that we don't have to go over and over the same thing again. Anytime you have fur or multiple little edges like this, always dry brush as a highlight when speed is an issue. This fur will end up looking pretty good with the wash in the shadows and this dry brush at the top, and it was the easiest part of the model. We barely spent any time on the fur, but it'll stand out when we're done. The eyeballs dried while we were doing the fur, so now it's time to do the pupils. We'll take some thin black paint and a fine detail brush and try to put a dot of black in there without splashing too horribly. You want to make the dot big enough so he doesn't look like he's wide-eyed and screaming. But when we're done here, the entire eye element will look a little too big. And that's by design. We knew we were going to splash around and kind of mess this up a little, and we'll clean it up when we highlight the skin. I can't finish the skin until the eyes are done drying, so we'll work on another element while they do. Each of the elements we had, the belt, the cloth, the bags, we're going to hit each of those with a highlight. So this belt, which was sort of a brownish yellow with a brown wash dumped on it, we're now going to hit it with a much lighter brownish yellow. I'll try to get all the edges. Edge highlighting is a really basic way to add some depth that looks good from, say, tabletop standard, and is not hard to do at all. So try to keep it as thin as possible, but sometimes you slop around a little bit. But when the edges of this belt are highlighted, contrasting with the dark shadows that the wash created when they pooled, in between the belt and the skin, say, it adds a real nice 3D effect. And now it's time to highlight the skin. We'll take a much lighter version of the pig flesh we started as a base coat. And I'll start with the eyeballs. I try to clean up around the edges of the eyeballs so they don't look so big and crazy. This has the dual effect of also highlighting the raised areas on his eyebrows, say, and on his cheekbones as they come up. It's much easier to work like this and work into the eye to just sort of close it up to make it more normal looking than it is just to try to paint a perfect eyeball from scratch. It's kind of easy to assume you'll mess up the eyeball a little, but since we're going to do this step anyway on the skin, we can use it to help fix any slop we had with the eyeball, while at the same time highlighting all his raised areas, his cheekbones, his ears, his lips. Just every part of his pig face we're going to tap with this highlight on all the raised areas. This is the eyeball where we really splash like crazy, so it takes a little bit of work to bring it down into sort of a normal eyeball size. That was all part of the plan. Some days, man, my eyeballs are like perfect, and I don't even have to do this step. Or I do it, but just to highlight the cheekbones, not to clean up any of the eyeball nonsense. And sometimes you don't. The face is easy, all the raised areas like the lips and the ears and stuff take this nicely and look good. After that, I work on the muscles. Anytime a rounded muscle is there, I just hit the upper area like that. Fingers are easy too. With just 3 paints, the base, the wash that we put after, and now this highlight, you can add a lot of depth to skin without very much work at all. Just tap each muscle, each raised area, and you're done. We apply this process to all the other elements. We hit the khaki with a lighter version of khaki. We hit the bags with a lighter version of green. The red bags with red, and so on and so forth. These guys aren't very complicated. There are only a few elements in the model, so it isn't hard to finish these highlights. The end result gives us a lot of depth for not a lot of work. The key to quick, effective batch painting like this is to get your order of operations down. Generally, you want to get your lower elements, like your skin, done first, and then work your way up the model. That way you won't go back and have to fix your problems over and over. You can slow yourself down if you have to keep correcting little splashes. Before you start, note if any of the effects you plan on using, like the rust effect we used for their armor, is going to result in a lot of messy splash work. Since we were dry brushing a lot, we wanted to get that done first. That saved us the step of going back and cleaning up the areas of the skin that might have had metal dry brushed onto them, because if even a little speck of metal gets on the skin, it's noticeable and you have to fix that. So just by doing this in the right order, we saved a lot of time. Painting entire units can be intimidating. You start with a big box full of metal bits, and it seems like it'll take forever before you actually get nice tabletop quality painted models on a table shooting at guys. But with a little planning, you can batch paint detailed models like this quickly and easily. Thank you for watching. You can see more guides, battle reports, and articles at Gearwig.com. You can email me at boss@Gearwig.com or check out our Facebook or Twitter pages. If you want to help the site, tell a friend and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.